Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, The State of the State, Missouri Writers on Missouri. My name is Mark Livingood. I'm the director of the Story Center at Mid-Continent Public Library. This year, the Story Center is partnering with the University of Missouri Extension's Community Arts Program to offer a series of unique programs that commemorate the Missouri Bicentennial. Called State of Stories, this series of free public programs features book conversations, storytelling workshops and performances, and humanities programs such as tonight's that explore the history and culture of the Show Me State. This program is supported by the William T. Kemper Foundation Commerce Bank trustee. Tonight's program features Dr. Sam Cohen. He's an associate professor of English at the University of Missouri-Columbia, where he teaches courses in 20th and 21st century American literature. Among the fellowships and awards he's received are the Davidson Faculty Fellowship and the Graduate Studies Outstanding Contribution Award. He's the author of After the End of History, American Fiction in the 1990s, published by the University of Iowa Press. Welcome, Sam. Thanks for being here tonight.
Hi. Thanks for having me. And thanks, everybody, for coming or clicking or whatever it is you did to get here. And thank you to the Story Center and Mid-Continent Public Library for sponsoring this. I have too much to say, so I'm going to jump right in as soon as my slides are up, and there they are. So here we go. I'd like to start with the work of a man who nobody thinks of as a Missouri writer. Born and raised in Northeast Texas, John Williams lived most of the rest of his life in Denver, earning a BA and an MFA at the University of Denver and spending 30 years on the faculty there. The 4 years Williams spent at the University of Missouri pursuing his PhD in the Department of English constitute the entirety of his life in Missouri. Not counting an apprentice novel he later disavowed, correctly, I think, he wrote 3 novels. One underappreciated classic, Stoner, published in 1965 and set decades earlier in that same department. One, arguably the first revisionist Western, 1960s Butcher's Crossing, set in Kansas and Colorado, and one novel of ancient Rome, Augustus. I think of Williams as a Missouri writer because of his connection to my department, but also because his books help me see something that I believe is central to Missouri and to its place in the nation's history. To show you what that something is, I'm going to tell you a little something about each of these books. Butcher's Crossing is the story of young Will Andrews, who at novel's opening in 1876 has left Harvard, inspired by his reading of Emerson and his frustration with trying to be a transparent eyeball in Cambridge, and is headed to the Kansas frontier town of the title, from where he will launch a buffalo hunting expedition and search for authentic nature and his own true self. In the mountains of Colorado, the hunting party finds one of the last giant herds of buffalo. Andrews has his encounter with the West there and with nature, and finds that it amounts to endless, mindless slaughter. In Stoner, young William Stoner walks 25 miles from his family's farm outside Boonville to Columbia in the fall of 1910 to study agricultural methods at the university. A class discussion of a Shakespeare sonnet excites him, in fact, nearly terrifies him, and he changes majors, stays for his MA and PhD, and joins the faculty, on which he stays for his entire career. He lives through 2 world wars, a turbulent marriage, the publication of 1 scholarly book, and 1 nasty intra-departmental feud. He also dedicates himself to teaching and to defending what he sees as the values of literary study. He retires and dies, as he lived, quietly. Augustus follows the story of the Roman emperor from the death of his great uncle, Julius Caesar, in his youth, through his rise to and consolidation of power, and tracks the personal cost of a series of dynastic marriages, including one arranged for his daughter, who he ends up banishing. The novel ends with the words of the dying Augustus as he looks back on his life and weighs the costs of the historic peace he built. As different as their settings and subjects are, each of these novels features a protagonist who over the course of his story tries to understand or define himself. Butcher's Crossing ends with Will Andrews heading not back east, but further west, freed from his illusions about the West and about the possibility of finding true nature, including his own. As an old Western hand puts it to Will, he's freed of the fancy lies, saying that there's nothing but yourself and what you could have done. Stoner begins on the very first page with the author telling us how forgettable his protagonist was how he failed to leave a mark on the world, not even on his own academic department. Still, in the end, as he lies on his deathbed, he realizes, in a moment that bookends the moment in class that inspired him to change his major, that the pursuit of knowledge matters, that it is, in some way, who he is. Quote, a sense of his own identity came upon him with a sudden force, and he felt the power of it. He was himself, and he knew what he had been. Williams even manages to bring alive this work of self-realization, of self-knowledge, even self-becoming in Augustus, a novel set a couple of millennia earlier. Through letters, this novel tracks the first Roman emperor through his life and career, including the telling changes of his name as his circumstances and ties to powerful figures change. Williams saves Augustus's own voice until the end, when he looks back on his life, on his choosing of his duty to Rome over his relationship with his daughter, and on the fate of his reign and of Rome itself, reflecting, I've come to believe that the life of every man, late or soon, there is a moment when he knows beyond whatever else he might understand, and whether he can articulate the knowledge or not, the terrifying fact that he is alone and separate, and that he can be no other than the poor thing that is himself. These stories of self-invention and self-realization are stories not just of knowing who you are, but of becoming who you are. Though in two of them we follow characters all the way to the ends of their lives, each could be seen as buildings remain, novels of education, of formation, which more narrowly follow characters only to adulthood, rather than through it. All three are also historical novels set many decades and even centuries before the time of their writing. While we're being flexible with terms, here's one that I've made up that I think can apply to Missouri in the light of these novels and of the other literary works I'm talking about tonight. Bildungsregion. If there are any German speakers out here, I don't mean school district, which I discovered is what that literally means, but I mean to indicate a place or a region of formation, and to suggest that it might be worthwhile to think of the state of Missouri not as a place with a fixed state, but rather as a state in a state of flux, of becoming, and not just in itself, but also and especially for the nation. While of course every place has a history of development and change, the particular history of Missouri has made it a place that has had to define and redefine itself, and if not the place where the US has had to define and redefine itself. As Walter Williams, first dean of the University of Missouri Journalism School, put it in a somewhat grandiose piece he wrote for the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, at least three times within its 3/4 of a century of its life as a sovereign state has it been the central figure of national political affairs swaying the policies of the republic. The role that Missouri has played in the nation's history goes beyond that, though maybe not quite as far as Williams would have it in the rest of this quote. One way it goes beyond that. While the European and later Upper South originating migrants to Missouri and their descendants were establishing it, Missouri was not only the starting place of Western expeditions and the hub of the fur trade, it was also setting a new national standard for the thorough removal of natives. These efforts reshaped the young state, as is attested to by its irregular northwest border, in red here, reset after the treaty-breaking annexation of the Platte Purchase, which the federal government had promised to Indian tribes it was removing from east of the Mississippi as part of Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. William Clark's last treaty gave the Iowa, Missouri, Sac and Fox, Oto and Potawatomi land in Kansas and Nebraska in exchange for their claim on the Platte region, and forcible removal accomplished the rest. By the end of the 1830s, there were nearly no Indians left in the state. As B.J. McMahon puts it in a 2013 issue of the Missouri Historical Society magazine, the interaction between Indians and white immigrants shaped the formation of Missouri, which in turn influenced the idea of manifest destiny and the settlement of the Great Plains. The ability to outmaneuver federal policy concerning the Indians may even have influenced locals, not just in Missouri, but across the South, to stand firm on the subject of states' rights to determine the issue of slavery. From Indian removal to slavery, both of which Walter Johnson, in The Broken Heart of America, frames as part of the larger history of racial capitalism, the changing state of the state of Missouri has been shaped by the history of the country and has shaped that history in return. The ongoing process of formation that the novels of John Williams point us to, then, can offer us a way to think about the state's history on its own and in national context, and so can provide a way to finding the state's history and the nation's in the works of Missouri writers. William Wells Brown, pictured here, was born into slavery in Kentucky in 1814 and raised in and around St. Louis. His work on steamboats gave him the chance to escape to the North, eventually giving abolitionist speeches in the Northeast and in England. While trapped in England by the 1850 passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, unable to return without risking capture, Brown wrote the first published novel by an African American. In that 1853 novel, published in England, Brown begins one chapter with the story of two ships. The first is the Mayflower, which he says brought men and women seeking to establish religious and political liberty in a new land, a ship he describes as bearing the seed wheat of states and empire. The second is the ship that brought the first cargo of slaves to Jamestown. These ships are the representation of good and evil in the New World, even to our day, he writes, asking, when shall one of those parallel lines come to an end? The novel in which Brown asks this question is Clotel, or the President's Daughter, a narrative of slave life in the United States. The president in question is Thomas Jefferson, who we don't see in the novel. The titular character, Clotel, doesn't make it to the end of the book. Having escaped slavery in the Deep South, she returns to Virginia to try to find her daughter, is captured and taken to Washington, D.C. to be sold, escapes again, and, about to be recaptured, throws herself to her death off of a bridge over the Potomac. In Brown's words, within plain sight of the president's house and the Capitol of the Union. After she sinks beneath the surface of the water, Brown adds, thus died Clotel, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, a president of the United States, a man distinguished as the author of the Declaration of American Independence and one of the first statesmen of that country. Brown's novel was an attempt to convince his British readers to put pressure on that country to end slavery. Seizing on the widely rumored existence of Jefferson's enslaved children, which has since been confirmed by DNA, Brown's purpose was not to show that the United States was rotten to the core from its beginning. Instead, he wanted to portray it as a land of contradictions, a nation whose history is marked by parallel lines, one tracing the history of efforts toward equality and liberty, the other tracing the establishment and protection of an institution that stood squarely against those efforts, both with beginnings that could be found more than a century and a half before the colonies asserted their independence. This purpose and this method mark this for me as a Missouri novel. It's significant that William Wells Brown hailed from the state whose petition for entry into the Union 202 years ago was described by Jefferson as a fire bell in the night, signaling the possible demise of the Union. It's a moment worth looking at more closely. Missouri's statehood was achieved through not one, but two compromises. The first is much better known today. In 1820, Congress said it could enter the Union as a slave state on the conditions, one, that it enter with the free state of Maine, and two, that its laws concerning slavery didn't infringe on the rights of anyone from outside the state. The second condition became an issue when the Constitution the state sent to Washington was found to contain a clause, now referred to as the Exclusion Clause, that barred free Negroes and mulattoes from entry. The resulting second compromise was part of the approval of the Constitution that stated that it should, quote, never be construed to authorize the passage of any law that might infringe on the rights of any other U.S. citizens. That is, Missouri couldn't pass laws authorized by its own federally approved Constitution. It is this language, which historian Sean Wilentz has described as perverse, that finally led to Missouri entering the Union. Brown's Clotel is marked by a deep sense of irony about the institution of slavery existing within a country founded on the notion of freedom, about the undercutting of its racial justification by the increasing presence of enslaved people of mostly European descent, like Jefferson's children, about his own situation in England, free but unable to return. I think this irony can be traced back to Brown's Missouri roots and to the irony of the state's founding. It can also be traced back to the part of the state Brown hailed from. The location of St. Louis, on the border of a free state and along a river that could take enslaved Missourians north to freedom or down the river to the Delta, known as the worst place to be enslaved, made it, ironically, a place where slave owners were known to be especially harsh to those they enslaved. Historians also agree that the disproportionate number of freedom suits in the state, and especially in St. Louis, suits like Dred Scott's, happened because of this location. As legal scholar David Koenig has written in explaining the number of freedom suits that originated in the area, Proximity to freedom sharpened the meaning of unfreedom. For Brown, it seems, it also sharpened the irony literally embodied in Jefferson's light-skinned offspring, making their existence emblematic of both the absurdity and cruelty of the racial fiction at the core of slavery. The power of that symbol endures in my town of Columbia. On the University of Missouri campus, a few yards from the columns, there's a statue of Thomas Jefferson donated in 2001 by a group of major donors called the Jefferson Club. Because of student protests like the one pictured in the previous slide, including the spray painting of Sally Hemings's name on the sidewalk, Jefferson's tombstone, which was given in 1883 by his descendants to the first public university in his Louisiana purchase, now stands inside a $20,000 acrylic box. These students aren't simply debating symbols. Within a mile of campus, you can find two reminders of another piece of history, the 1923 lynching of James Scott, a University of Missouri janitor. One is his grave, which is now marked by a new gravestone erected in 2011. Another is the plaque marking a spot where the lynching occurred on a bridge that is no longer there. Nothing marked this spot until 2016, when a student group spearheaded its creation. When this local history is unburied and marked, just as when local monuments to national figures are questioned and complicated, we are seeing the growing pains of our state and our nation. Another book that tells the story of the Bildung in this region, the formation of this country in this place, is a late novel by an obscure 19th century novelist named Mark Twain, born in 1835 in Florida, Missouri, a then small, now uninhabited village on the Salt River, 20 miles southwest of the Mississippi River town of Hannibal, where he was raised. Twain wrote a novel late in his career, in 1893 and 1894, 2 decades after the adventures of Tom Sawyer and one after the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, called Pudd'nhead Wilson. Like those earlier, more popular novels, it's set in a fictionalized version of his hometown of Hannibal. In this case, not Tom and Huck St. Petersburg, but Dawson's Landing. Like Clotel, it tells a story about multiracial characters under slavery. Unlike Clotel, though, it was written not at mid-century, but at century's end, and by the son of a slave owner. It tells the story of Roxy, a light-skinned woman owned by one of the town's leading families, descended from the first families of Virginia, as I like to remind people, and the 2 infant boys in her charge, her master's son and her own son, by another leading citizen, who are of similar appearance and who Roxy switches to save her son from being sold down the river. It ends with the 2 boys, now men, restored to their rightful identities. Roxy's son, who murdered the man he thought was his uncle, is sold down the river despite decades of efforts by Roxy to save him from that fate. And her master's son, restored to whiteness, is left comfortable with neither the enslaved people with whom he grew up or their owners. Like Clotel, Pudd'nhead exposes the belief in race to ridicule, but in some ways it's a harsher laughter than Clotel's, and its message is murky. Does Roxy's son turn out the way he does because of the way he's raised, or because, as his own mother says, of the 1/32nd of him that's black? Is there no way the story could have ended well? There's nothing murky in the abolitionist Clotel, written during the years before the Civil War when Dred Scott worked its way to the Supreme Court. But there's a pessimism in Pudd'nhead's ending, written after the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction, and during the time when Plessy v. Ferguson was working its way through the courts. When Missouri's highest court's reversal of Scott's original freedom suit victory was upheld by the Supreme Court, Roger Taney's decision held that black people, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. 35 years later, after emancipation and the failed attempt to achieve legal equality, the courts were again addressing equality, deciding in 1896 that separate could be equal. I won't read it, but look at the precise, absurd attention to the admixture of blood in this passage from that decision for evidence of how far US racial attitudes had not progressed in all that time. If you read late Twain, especially the things that weren't published until after his death, you know how deep his pessimism ran at the end of his career and life, and how low his opinion of humanity in general had sunk. See, for example, the short 1895 piece naming humans as the lowest animal. His experience of history in his home state and his nation had dimmed his hopes for both, and for humans everywhere over the course of his life, and it made it hard for him to imagine a happy ending. The writer Jack Conroy, pictured here, on the other hand, was born with apparently undimmable hopes, in spite of coming from a time and place that must have tested them. Conroy was born and raised outside Moberly in Monkey Nest mining camp at the turn of the century. His first novel was based on these early years. In 1933's The Disinherited, Larry Donovan grows up in poverty in a coal mining camp that took the life of his father and brothers, works in the rail yards, travels the Midwest looking for work during the Depression, and after the stock market crashes, returns home to care for his mother and to begin to fight, as his father did, against the strikebreakers and bankers who plagued them. The novel ends speaking for the rights of the common man and woman, with Donovan giving an inspirational speech to a crowd that had just banded together and kept lawmen and an auctioneer from selling off a repossessed farm, and heading off into the sunset to work to organize other crowds against other men bent on exploiting them. It is a hard-won commitment, not a romantic notion. As Donovan says of himself, after the organizer he wants to head west with warns him about the hardships that await, "I sweated away my illusions long ago." The same is true of Conroy. Awakened to the cause of workers by his experiences, by the labor movement active in St. Louis, by the strong Midwestern tradition of radicalism, and by the work of artists and writers interested in and sympathetic to working class people in a way that not much art was then, Conroy went on to become a Midwestern William Dean Howells, as editor of a number of little magazines in the 1930s, most notably The Anvil, pictured here, publishing the work of little-known writers such as Tennessee Williams, well, then little-known, Richard Wright, Erskine Caldwell, Langston Hughes, and James Farrell. Through the Illinois Writers Project and alongside Arnaud Bontemps, he also wrote two important early works in Black studies, including 1945's They Seek a City. A champion of work by African-American writers and a believer in the potential of an integrated labor movement, influenced by the 1930s labor movement in St. Louis and its example of Black and white workers organizing together, Conroy's work fell out of favor by mid-century. His much praised The Disinherited and his second less successful novel, 1935's A World to Win, were pigeonholed as proletarian fiction and quickly went out of print. Despite his lack of interest in Marxism, Cold War literary politics were unkind to him. Though there was a 1960s revival of attention in his work, and I love the 1960s reprinting cover there. And now I've lost my place admiring that cover. And the University of Missouri Press keeps The Disinherited in print. That would be the cover on the right. To read Conroy today is still to engage in an act of unearthing, not just of the work itself and of the man who wrote it, but of a whole half-buried history of labor radicalism and writing in Missouri and the Midwest. It is a history in which bosses used racism to keep white workers focused on something other than their own economic exploitation. Efforts the St. Louis General Strike of 1877 and many Depression-era strikes countered, only to be undermined by union leaders themselves hostile to racial solidarity. It is a history worth unearthing, beyond its being fascinating reading, because it serves as a helpful reminder in the current labor-hostile climate of our state, with its perennial efforts to pass right to work, in big irony quotes, legislation, that it has not ever been thus, that there's a proud native counter-tradition available, one whose eye remained on the parallel line of equality running alongside that of economic exploitation. As The Disinherited shows us, the state and the nation have long fought this struggle. I'd like to make a quick stop next in our whirlwind tour of Missouri's literary history at a poem by another product of Moberly, born in 1898, the year before Jack Conroy, and 2 years after Plessy v. Ferguson, Melvin B Thompson. Growing up, Tolson moved around with his family to various small-town posts taken by his minister father and spent his high school years in Kansas City. He studied and taught at HBCUs, along the way earning a master's in literature at Columbia University. And in addition to his poetry, is known for his success coaching debate teams to victory against teams from prestigious whites-only schools. There's even a movie about this part of his life in which he's played by Denzel Washington, which he could do worse. Tolson is best known for long, late poems, Libretto for the Republic of Liberia in 1953 and Harlem Gallery, 1965. But I'd like to look at a poem from his first book, 1944's Rendezvous with America, because it captures a vision common to much of Tolson's work, one that I think connects to Wells Brown's in Clotel and with our consideration of Missouri through its literary works as Bildungsregion. That poem, also titled Rendezvous with America, tells the story of America in the way that the title says, as a rendezvous with a place and an idea, even an ideal. It is not a one-time event or a finished one, but a journey toward and a meeting with that is ongoing and has been more than a little rocky from the start. The poem, structured in 10 numbered parts, begins in an echo, I think, of Clotel. Time unhinged the gates of Plymouth Rock and Jamestown and Ellis Island, and worlds of men with hungers of body and soul hazarded the wilderness of waters, cadenced their destinies with the potter's wheeling miracles of mountains and valley, prairie and river. These men are from all over the world, from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and are of all colors, and they, quote, mix their bloods and sow their seeds, in the poem's words, and the country belongs to all of them. This poem might be less polished and complex than Tolson's later poems, but it very powerfully expresses celebration of this confluence, as it does in part 6, which consists of stanzas that recognize America's virtues as well as its failings. And I'll let you read it. The poem is structured around these ideas, that the country is built on people who came from elsewhere, that it is marked by racism, that it often fails to live up to its ideals, but sometimes succeeds. Towards the end of the poem, Tolson reinforces the idea that the rendezvous of America with its potential is ongoing. This is the opening of part 8, and I guess I'll read this part. I have a rendezvous with America at Plymouth Rock, where the Mayflower lies, battered beam on beam by Titan-chested waves that heave and shock in cold December winds, that in the riggings pound their fists and scream, here, now. The Pilgrim Fathers draw the New World's testament of faith and law, a government of and by and for the people, a pact of peers who share and bear and plan, a government which leaves men free and equal, and yet knits men together as one man. And when I read that, I hear Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem a little bit, in addition to other things, but I think it's an interesting echo. Born in a country that had just reaffirmed the ideal of African-American citizenship in order to continue segregation, and in a state founded on exclusion, Tolson maintains his belief in the American idea, what he calls here a pact of peers. The writer saw many different Missouri towns in his family's relocations and many parts of the country in his own career, a debater able to construct strong affirmative as well as negative arguments. Tolson was able in his poetry to affirm, with all the negatives taken into account, the proposition that there was a future America that America could grow into. T.S. Eliot, on the other hand, was a poet who seemed not much interested in America or what it might become. Eliot, born in 1888 in St. Louis and raised there, went away for a year of preparatory school at Milton Academy in Massachusetts, continued on to Harvard, and after a few years of back and forthing over the Atlantic while doing graduate work, made a permanent move to England in 1915, becoming a British subject in 1927, and later renouncing his American citizenship entirely. He's often thought of as a British poet. His earliest works, such as his first published poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which appeared in 1915 and which he began writing in 1910, do not bear any identifying marks of Americanness, like setting or allusion to American writers or history. Like Prufrock 1922's The Wasteland, one of the most influential poems in 20th century literature, was heavily British in inspiration. In addition to borrowing from classical and East and South Asian traditions, it reaches back to British sources such as stories of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King, and takes in modern British life. From the beginning, his poetry was in many ways backward-looking, unsettled by the changes in modern, particularly urban life, and it grew increasingly more conservative and occasionally anti-Semitic, as in the Four Quartets. He's been read as a modernist poet, and therefore as a poet interested not only in formal experimentation, but in reflecting an alienation from the world of the sort expressed by the name-given writers of his era, particularly after the Great War, the Lost Generation. But his alienation had a very particular flavor. When thinking about Eliot's particular flavor of alienation, it's important to remember that he was very much an American and a Missourian in his roots, and to note the shape those roots took. His grandfather came west to St. Louis from an old Boston family and was a founder of Washington University. His father, a successful businessman, a brickmaker, brought the family to Massachusetts for summers, and Eliot himself spent half of the aughts and half of the teens there. His family was a part of the St. Louis that saw itself as more eastern outpost than gateway to the West. As he himself put it in a letter to a friend, "Someday I want to write an essay about the point of view of an American who isn't an American, because he was born in the South and went to school in New England as a small boy with an N-word drawl, but who wasn't a Southerner in the South because his people were Northerners in a border state and looked down on all Southerners and Virginians, and who so was never anything anywhere." The settings of Eliot's poems are, for a time, nowhere, and later they are England, but somewhere in these poems must be the experience of a writer who in 1928 said of himself, "It was not until years of maturity that I perceived that I myself had always been a New Englander in the Southwest and a Southwesterner in New England. In New England, I miss the long, dark river, the ailanthus trees, the flaming cardinal birds, the high limestone bluffs. In Missouri, I miss the fir trees, the bay and goldenrod, the song sparrows, the red granite, and the blue sea of Massachusetts." This curious border city of Eliot's youth, situated in the South or the Southwest, produced a writer who returned not to the river, but via New England to the English roots of his family, which had left it in 1660, and who, rather than embracing what his home state and country might become, or fighting to determine the course of that becoming, turned instead to an ancestral and literary past, maybe to create something new, maybe just to rescue old things, not all of them good. I just want to mention my colleague Francis Dickey, just a couple months ago, came out with an article about Eliot's childhood experience of the changing demographics of St. Louis, which was being affected by the early Great Migration, so a big influx of African Americans from the South fleeing Jim Crow. And she makes a really interesting argument about how this informed his urban imagery, which is transplanted to London or Paris, but also his sense of alienation. So everything I just said might be wrong. I don't think so, but because it adds an interesting wrinkle to it. I'd like to turn next, quickly, to two writers from the city that Eliot left behind, neither of whom were born in the city, and neither of whom stayed for long, but both of whom were shaped by their time and wrote works explicitly about it. I'll look at just one work by each. The first is by Ntozake Shange, best known for her 1976 hybrid poetry drama dance work. I think she called it a choreo poem, for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is an F. That work, that we'll talk about quickly, is the 1985 novel Betsy Brown, a Bildungsroman set in the late 1950s in the wake of the decision in Brown v. Board of Ed and the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The title character's part in the integration of a white school in St. Louis is central to her experience, and the novel revolves around Betsy's struggles with her feelings about race and the civil rights movement, as well as with her coming awareness of her sexuality, of the realities of being female in a male-dominated society, and of her class position. It's not Shange's most radical or formally experimental work, and it might not be her finest, in part because it is in some ways pretty simple. I like it, but I'm a simple guy, I guess. This may be in part because, as she has said in interviews, it was written to be the book she wishes she'd had as a child. She wished this because a book like it might have helped her when she moved with her middle-class family from Trenton, New Jersey to St. Louis, where she too helped to integrate a white school. Betsy Brown comes out of Shange's experience of St. Louis, a city that was ending de jure segregation, but would see it endure de facto into the 1970s. A city that replaced segregation ordinances in housing, once outlawed, with racial covenants and urban renewal. The author's experience in Missouri was also shaped by her family's having come, like Eliot's, from the Northeast. In the novel, Betsy's mother refers to their move as a move to the South and calls St. Louis a city that might as well be below the Mason-Dixon line. Her father describes it as a city they still couldn't call their own. In Betsy Brown, Shange looks back at school desegregation from the 1980s, a time when the civil rights gains of the 60s were under attack by the Reagan administration, which actively attempted to roll them back, attacking affirmative action and other programs designed to address historical and contemporary wrongs, promoting creations like reverse racism and the figure of the welfare queen. In the process, Reagan demonized the 1960s as the moment when everything went wrong for America, depicting the 1950s as a time when things were simple and right, and hailing his present efforts to return America to that time and those values as an attempt to bring about morning in America again. The rise of multiculturalism in the 1980s was in part a response to Reagan, a reassertion of a more inclusive idea of what an American was and of what America could be. Betsy Brown can also be seen as Shange's response to Reagan, looking back at her time in St. Louis from Reagan's 80s. And what she saw wasn't Brown's Mayflower or Tolson's Pilgrims and their city on a hill. She saw a city that wasn't ready to grant her family full citizenship, a city that she couldn't call her own, excuse me, and might never. Naomi Shihab Nye was born and raised in Ferguson in the 1950s and 60s, living there until her early teens when her family briefly relocated to Jerusalem before settling down in San Antonio. She's known as a Palestinian-American poet, but she's written about life in Texas and, as we can see in the 2016 poem I'm about to show you, about life in Missouri. We can also see in this poem the power of things left unsaid. As Shange doesn't have to mention the present of her writing to draw connections to the past she's describing, so Nye can connect different times without even mentioning one of them. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read the whole thing. It's only 2 slides. To Jamille Bolden of Ferguson, Missouri. 50 years before you did your homework in Ferguson, we did our homework in Ferguson, thinking life was fair. If we didn't do our homework, we might get a U, unsatisfactory. Your dad says you didn't even get to see the rest of the world yet. I've seen too much of the world and don't know how to absorb this. A girl shot through a wall. You. I'd give you some of my years if I could. You should not have died that night. There was absolutely no reason for you to die. I'd like to be standing in a sprinkler with you, the way we used to do, kids before air conditioning, safe with our friends in the drenching of cool, safe with our shrieks and summer shorts and happy hair. Where can we go without thinking of you now? Did you know there was a time Ferguson was all a farm? It fed St. Louis. Giant meadows of corn, sweet potatoes, laden blackberry bushes, perfect tomatoes in crates, and everything was shovels and hoes, and each life, even the little tendril of a vine, mattered. And you did your homework and got an S for satisfactory. Super. Instead of the S of sorrow, now stamped on our hands. The unmentioned connection, of course, is to the 2014 unrest in Ferguson. Jamille Bolden was a 9-year-old girl who was accidentally shot and killed in Ferguson just over a year after the death of Michael Brown. This poem about her manages, without mentioning Brown or anything else, to both bring the history William Wells Brown and Melvin Tolson trace to Plymouth Rock and Jamestown, to present-day Missouri, and also to show how Missouri has been and continues to be central to the unrolling of Brown's parallel lines. This history is invoked without any need of mentioning race, or explaining the history of housing in St. Louis, or the 400-year history of slavery and its aftermath in this country. The events of Ferguson a year before this poem are invoked simply by naming the city. By returning to the Ferguson of her youth and before, to a time of sprinklers and safety, and to an earlier time of natural life and growth, Nye brings our attention to lives cut short unnaturally. Simply by mentioning Ferguson in 2016, the time of the poem's publication, she brings our attention to more recent history that was made in Ferguson and to the long ongoing history of violence and discrimination in St. Louis, in Missouri, and in America. A history registered in ordinances and covenants and state constitutions. That which is unsatisfactory about the present, the poem says, without saying it, is the result of past actions and current structures. What the poem doesn't quite say, in the antepenultimate lines invoking of Black Lives Matter, which grew from a hashtag to a movement in Ferguson, is that what's unsatisfactory doesn't have to be permanent. Daniel Woodrow is another writer like John Williams, who's been called the best writer that you've never heard of. Unlike Williams, he's a native Missourian from Springfield and still lives here in the Ozarks town of West Plains. Also, unlike Williams, he's returned again and again in his novels to Missouri, more specifically to the Ozarks, so often that the country noir label that he invented for his work might as well be called Ozark Noir. I'd like to take a quick look at Woodrow's 2006 novel, Winter's Bone, because it belongs to what might appear to be a different Missouri than that of most of the works and writers we've looked at tonight. Winter's Bone is the story of Ree Dolly, a 17-year-old girl whose father, a methamphetamine cook like most of the men in their clan, spread out over the hollows and woods of the area, has disappeared, having put up their ramshackle home as collateral for his bail. Ree has 2 little brothers who she struggles to feed, along with her mother, who has herself disappeared into mental illness The four of them will be without a home if her father doesn't turn up for his court date or turn up dead, which would free them of the debt. The novel follows Rhee as she tries to save her home. As she travels far out on the branches of her kinship tree in an effort to find her father, or at least find out what happened to him, we learn more about the ways in which these families have gotten by, outside of the law, but within rules and beliefs they've lived by for a long time. The unrelenting poverty in which Rhee lives, the dialect, and the violent ways of the people she lives with may have something to do with how the novel has been read by critics as like Greek tragedy, full of symbols and myths and timeless truths. The truth is, though, that the extreme poverty and other conditions that led to the Ozarks becoming the meth capital of the country are real. While the ubiquity of meth labs has dipped since their high in the first decade of the century, in part due to a surge of Mexican cartel production, the conditions that prevailed when Woodrow wrote his novel haven't gone away. As you can see in this slide, the first European descended settlers in the Ozarks came from southern Appalachia early in the 19th century. By mid-century, they were joined by Irish and German immigrants. Out of these Scots, Irish, English, and German roots grew the regional culture, a poor white culture largely isolated for generations by rough, rocky terrain, and it has persisted through the vigilante violence of the Civil War and after, when many ex-Confederate soldiers took to the woods, and through economic change in the surrounding lowlands. The wooded plateau has limited agriculture and other avenues of economic development. Jobs in manufacturing, technology, even service jobs becoming so ubiquitous in the economy of other parts of the state and country are harder to come by there. The results are what the public health people, as in the study pictured here, call persistent poverty, the turn to an alternative economy, and the distrust of government and the law we see in the people of Winter's Bone. The sense among these often related clannish characters that they are the best ones to handle their own business, despite ancient religion-based rifts and violent pasts. So Winter's Bone is not timeless Greek tragedy about universal human frailties. It's a document of a particular place and a particular time that readers might be more comfortable seeing as neither. It's a place and time marked by rising mortality rates due to the meth and now opioid crises, and other things that are themselves the effect of historical conditions that go unaddressed. The novel doesn't touch on the connections between the promotion of white supremacy and racial capitalism, between the use of racism to continue the exploitation and lack of care for poor white Americans. But reading it correctly, that is not as myth-informed Shakespearean tragedy, but as realist reflection on the place, might help us to better understand their effects. I'd like to end with something completely different. A magazine story by one of my favorite Missouri writers, Kansas City native Calvin Trillin. For decades, Trillin has been a columnist for a number of magazines, including The New Yorker, The Nation, and Time. He wrote about the civil rights movement in a famous series of columns for The New Yorker, including one about the integration of the University of Georgia, that became his first book, 1964, as An Education in Georgia. And pictured here is the original article, along with a photo of Trillin with John Lewis, a young John Lewis. Also a young Trillin. He is also responsible for a long-running series of political poems in The Nation that, by my unofficial estimation, have to contain more dad jokes than any other print source in history. But Trillin may be best known as a food writer, rather than a dad joker. And the piece I want to look at is his 1972 Playboy essay about Kansas City restaurants. The essay, whose title, as you can see, is No, is a paean to the food of Trillin's hometown. It's more than a bit tongue-in-cheek. It opens, the best restaurants in the world are, of course, in Kansas City. Not all of them, only the top 4 or 5. And it's about more than Kansas City dining. He makes plain that it's also about hometown nostalgia, as when he reproduces a conversation with his wife Alice in a restaurant on the side of the Long Island Expressway, in which he says, "Anybody who served a milkshake like this in Kansas City will be put in jail." To which Alice responds, "You promise not to indulge any of that hometown nostalgia while I'm eating. You know it gives me heartburn." The other thing it's about, which he does not make quite as plain, emerges when he turns to the subject of Arthur Bryant's, writing, "It has long been acknowledged that the single best restaurant in the world is Arthur Bryant's Barbecue at 18th and Brooklyn in Kansas City." But Arthur Bryant's is not that less plain thing either, though he does love it. What that thing is starts to become clear when he realizes during a conversation with Arthur Bryant himself that when he'd first started going there in the 1950s, they must have been the only integrated restaurant in the city. And when he says so, Bryant confirms it, adding that when mixed groups of soldiers came to town back then, they were sent there. Upon hearing this, Trilling writes, he had a vision of a white soldier and a black soldier, buddies from Fort Riley, who were told by a woman at the USO that they can't go to the overpriced and underseasoned restaurants downtown, are directed instead to what she calls a little place in Colored Town. Nervous as they walk through the neighborhood, the white soldier wonders if not paying attention to the color of a man's skin is such a good idea after all. But when he gets to Arthur Bryant's, he realizes, quote, he is in, all caps, the single best restaurant in the world. For perhaps the only time in the history of the Republic, Trilling writes, virtue has been rewarded. It's a small moment in the essay, but it's the heart of it. Trilling, for whom food is never just food, for Trilling, for whom food is never just food, it's a fantasy of virtue rewarded, of good food and good-hearted people coming together, and of his hometown being a place where such a thing can happen. The essay ends with another imagined moment, this one of Trilling speaking to the mayor and city council, urging them to honor Henry Perry, the man who originated barbecue in Kansas City, and whose restaurant the Bryant brothers took over, and who is therefore, quote, the man who should be recognized as the one towering figure of our culture. When they resist, Trilling responds, what I can't understand is why this town is full of statues of the farmers who came out to steal land from the Indians, and full of statues of the businessmen who stole the land from the farmers, but doesn't even have a $3 plaque somewhere for Henry Perry. Again encountering resistance, he ends the imaginary conversation and the essay thusly. As you politicians are always saying, we have got to reorder our priorities. So while I said this was something completely different, it's really not. It's another piece of Missouri literature that shows Missouri to be a state whose state is flux. The flux of our nation's bildungsregion, of a place where the country is finding and becoming itself. It does so as those to whom it matters work to extend the line that started in Plymouth Rock past the one that started in Jamestown. To, in Trilling's words, reorder our priorities. Works of literature that show us the heroism of these attempts, the irony attendant to the failures, and the power of literary imagination to envision a better state. These works, and this may sound dumb or anticlimactic to say, but I think it's an important part of my job, these works are worth reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
My pleasure.
We have time for questions for Dr. Sam Cohen from University of Missouri and his presentation. If you'd like to type in your comments, we can relay them to Sam, and any questions you may have or comments to start a conversation here, please just enter them in, and we'll see where that leads us. Any comments? I have a question for you, Sam.
Hit me.
One of the questions I have is where are we now? If Missouri's still in flux and is still being formulated, what are the forces that are shaping it now? And I guess this is a two-sided question. That's one. And then the follow-up is where and how is that being expressed? Who's capturing that? And not only where and how is it being expressed, who is doing that, and then who's reading it?
Those are good questions. I'm not sure I can answer all of them. I was just writing something today about the experience of being someone teaching this kind of stuff while the state legislature is trying to outlaw the teaching of this kind of stuff. There have been bills and amendments to bills in the State House about the 1619 Project, which, if people don't know, is a New York Times sponsored attempt to reread American history back to the year when the first slaves landed at Jamestown, right, which we've been talking about, which they've connected to critical race theory in a way that doesn't indicate that they have any idea what it really is. And I was saying that in this thing that I was writing, it's the same forces, right? It's the same long story of people not wanting the story to go a certain way and not wanting the story of how it's gone so far to be told in a certain way. So I don't know if there are any new forces. I invented for this piece something called the 2016 Project, which is, for me, just a way to think about what's happening now since Trump administration began. But one of the painful things about it is that it's not something new. As to the second part of your project, there are a ton of Missouri writers, and I don't know enough of them. So there are poems, there are young poets out there, there are photographers who are collecting photos of the sort of side of St. Louis that is the empty, falling apart buildings that are being stripped for their bricks because the bricks are worth something, and the copper is worth something. So there are different kinds of multimedia things out there. And I think a lot of the response ends up having that sort of documentary impulse, right? Like that sort of witnessing, showing what's happening impulse.
Karen Rogers has a question here. Hi, Sam. Maybe I missed this and I joined late, but how do you define Missouri writer? Anyone who lived here at any point or more specific? And thanks for your shout out to the Story Center, Karen. We appreciate you being here.
Karen, that's a good question. And I play pretty fast and loose with it. Some of this talk is drawn from a course I just taught for the first time on Missouri writers. And we had fun during the semester with students questioning just how I got this person to qualify as a Missouri writer rather than that person. I try to have it be someone who either is a longtime native or somebody, if they were only here for a few years, who was here during a formative period, right? So Maya Angelou was not here for many years, but if you've read the memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, some of those very formative years were in St. Louis. I think John Williams is probably the biggest stretch, and it's a little bit of home cooking as the referee because he was in my department. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, but it's fun. It's a fun exercise, right? Like you're not making a definitive claim for a state. You're just saying it's interesting to put these two things together. Like, what about Williams's work says something about Missouri and vice versa? Thank you for the question.
Barbara has a question. What do you think is about this history that's unique, and how has it affected development of the state and the country? So it gets back to that dynamic that you mentioned.
It's a key question to my argument and sort of this kind of exercise, because one response could be, we have stories like this and works like this from every state in the union, right? But I think there's something particular to Missouri's geographic location, historical circumstances, and maybe even the character of the kinds of people who came here, right, from the Upper South, that made it really pivotal in American history, right? So from the Missouri Compromise, earlier to Lewis and Clark and so much Western exploration coming out of Missouri, and also the Southwest, right? The donkey trains to the Southwest. And as Walter Johnson, who I mentioned, and I'll put in a plug for this book, which you can't see at all, The Broken Heart of America, argues the combination of slavery and forced Indian removal make for a really potent formula for America going forward, not just to the West, but in the world, right, as a world power, in a way that I think makes not just St. Louis, as Johnson argues, but the state as a kind of a unique case.
And Barbara had another question. Were any of these authors influenced by one another?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm looking back at my screen where I've got pictures of them all up. It's impossible to imagine Twain not having an influence on many of these writers, because Twain just had a huge, towering influence on lots of writers. I think that the attention to dialect and local ways of speaking certainly shows up in Woodrow and elsewhere. And I think there's a line of African-American writers influencing each other that we can see here. So I don't actually know if Tolson was a reader of William Wells Brown, but it's kind of impossible to imagine that he wasn't. And the echoes of the themes within the two would certainly seem to indicate that. But that's an interesting question. And I don't know who Trillin read. Trillin probably read everybody, including menus.
Yeah. If you have any other questions, please feel free to type them in. I do want to mention that this program is part of the State of Stories programming, like I mentioned in the introduction, that looks at the history and culture of the state of Missouri. And one of the projects that we undertook at the Story Center was the publication of a poetry anthology from Kansas City poets. And so it's called Curating Home. We published it with Woodneath Press, which is an imprint of the Story Center. And it features 35 about 35 poets. And we just published it last month. And the response was really interesting. And you talked about the documentary impulse. That's something that definitely came across in a lot of the poems that we published in that anthology.
And it's Curating
Home.
Curating Home.
Curating Home.
Thank you.
And it was edited by Marianne Kunkel, Glenn North, and Jose Faust. So that was a great addition to this series of programs that we've been doing at the Story Center for the bicentennial.
And one thing I'd like to get into, I mean, as I was saying, this is just the first time that I've taught this course this past semester, is finding out more of the authors who I don't know, more of the young writers, and especially those who are coming out from small presses. There's a lot of writers whose work is coming out, not just in little magazines for poets, but novelists whose work is coming out with small regional presses that really have great work. There are some Midwestern presses, all the names that just flew out of my brain. One of them just published a memoir by someone who grew up on the north side of St. Louis in the 50s. That's fantastic. And I can neither remember the name of the author or the book or the press. Belt Publishing, I think. Does that ring a bell? I think it's Belt Publishing. So I got one of the three. But I really want to spend more time. And if anybody wants to email me, cohenss@missouri.edu, to put it in the chat. If they want to recommend people who I should be reading and teaching, I would be super grateful. Because I'm from New Jersey. I didn't mention that. I'm just a student of Missouri.
Let me put your, do you want me to put Cohen S?
2 S's, Cohen SS.
Cohen SS at missouri.edu. I just put that in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
And the other thing I'm going to put in the chat right now is a link to the program survey that we hope you'll take time to fill out on your way out before you head off for the evening. I'm going to paste that in right now. We appreciate your feedback, and I think I'm going to send that out, and then we've got a couple other questions here. Karen says there's an interesting book called The King of Kings County from a KC author and residents that looks at segregation in KC via a fictional city.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think the Story Center needs to put together a list of Kansas City books.
That would be great.
Yeah. Any other questions for Sam? No, well, Sam, thanks so much for being here, taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad we could do
It was
this.
great. Thank you, everybody, for coming again.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank all the audience for being here too. Keep in touch. We have programs for State of Stories happening until the end of August. So if you take a look at our webpage, right there it is, mystorycenter.org, and invite you to join us in the future for another program. And Sam, we hope to see you back too.
Hope so. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.